Okay, we are back now for part 2 of chapter 2. And we left off, we haven't covered it yet, but we're going to talk now about utilitarianism. Okay, and utilitarianism is a teleological ethical system. And a teleological ethical system judges the consequences of an act. Even a bad act, if it results in good consequences, can be defined as good under that teleological system. You know, the saying, the end justifies the means, is a teleological statement. But utilitarianism, again, is the ethical system that claims that the greatest good is that which results in the greatest happiness for the greatest number of individual. And, major proponents are the authors Bentham and Mill. And again, by definition, utilitarianism is a teleological ethical system. What is good is determined by the kind of the consequences of the actions, etc. So the utilitarian doctrine asserts that we should always act to produce the greatest possible ratio of good to evil for everyone concerned. That is, if one can show that an action significantly contributes to the general good, then it is good. And hopefully that kind of makes sense to everybody, right? Again, the teleological ethical system is that ethical system that is concerned with the consequences or ends of an action to determine goodness. Kind of like what we said, even a bad act, if it results in good consequences, can be defined as good. And we talked about that end justifies the mean statement is in fact a teleological statement, if you will. So we know that there's criticisms, if you will, right, to everything. So although utilitarianism is quite prevalent in ethical reasoning, there are some serious criticisms. And the first would be all pleasures or benefits are not equal or of equal value. So Bentham did not judge the relative weight of, utility. He considered pleasure to be good, whether it derived from vice, such as, greed, etc., or from virtue, such as charity or kindness. And later utilitarians, primarily John Stuart Mill, believed that benefits, the utilities or benefits, to use a different word, had different weights or values. In other words, some were better than others, right? So for instance, art offers more utility for society than alcohol, even though they both may bring benefit to individuals. Does that kind of make sense? So hopefully that's an okay example. The next would be the system presumes that one can predict the consequences of one's actions. Well, in the well-known lifeboat dilemma, 5 people are in a lifeboat with enough food and water for only 4. And it is certain that they will survive, if there are only 4. It is also certain that they will all perish if one does not go overboard. So what should be done, right? Under ethical formalism, it would be unthinkable to sacrifice an innocent, even if it means that all will die. Under utilitarian ethics, it is conceivable that the murder of one might be justified to save others. So, but this hypothetical situation points out the kind of the fallacy, if you will, of utilitarian argument. In real life, it would not be known whether any would survive regardless of whatever decision, right? The fifth might be murdered and 5 minutes later a rescue ship appears on the horizon. So there, there's some criticism there. And then finally, there's little concern for individual rights. So ethical formalism demands that everyone must be treated with respect and not to be used as a, quote, remember, means to an end. However, under utilitarianism, the rights of one individual may be sacrificed for the good of many. So those are some criticism. And utilitarianism also has two forms. They have act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. So, act utilitarianism, the basic utility derived from an action is alone examined. Under rule utilitarianism, one judges an action in reference to the precedent it sets and the long-term utility of the rule set by that particular action. So again, because there's so many definitions, especially in this chapter, there's not quite as many in other chapters, but this chapter is loaded with definitions. So make sure you go through some of those definitions and use the non-graded exercise in your chapter. So now we're going to talk about the ethics of care. So the ethics of care is based on human relationship and needs. And the ethics of care has been described as kind of feminine morality because women in all societies are the child bearers and consequently seem to have greater sensitivity to issues. Okay? So by definition, ethics of care, the ethical system that defines good as meeting the needs of others and preserving and enriching relationships. Okay? So again, when you look at some of the points of this, it's based on human relationships and needs. Again, it's described as a more feminine morality. It leads not to different solutions necessarily, but perhaps different questions. Eastern religions such as Taoism are consistent with ethics of care, and also in law enforcement, the restorative justice movement is very consistent with the ethics of care as well. So that's another kind of thing that we're looking at here. So just kind of a little bit more here. Next, we're going to talk about the peacemaking process. Okay, in their text, Braswell and Gold in 2002 discuss a concept called peacemaking justice. And they show that the concept is derived from ancient principles, and it concerns care as well as other concepts. So peacemaking, as evolved from an ancient spiritual and wisdom tradition, has included the possibility of mercy and compassion within the framework of justice. So Braswell and Gold propose that the peacemaking process is composed of three parts, and that would be connectedness, caring, and mindfulness. And I kind of tell you what they are. So connectedness refers to the interrelationships we have with one another. Caring refers to the concept that the natural inclination of all humans is to care for one another. And then mindfulness is being aware of others and the world in all personal decision making. So that's the peacemaking process, or what they might also call peacemaking justice. Egoism postulates that what is good for one's survival and personal happiness is in fact moral. The extreme of this position is that all people should operate on the assumption that they can do whatever benefits themselves. Others become solely the means to ensure the happiness. There is no recognition of the rights of others under this particular system. So by definition, egoism the ethical system that defines the pursuit of self-interest as a moral good. And a little bit more, egoism also postulates that, again, what is good for one's survival and personal happiness is moral. They also talk about two other elements. They talk about psychological egoism and enlightened egoism. So psychological would be humans are naturally egoists, right? And the enlightened egoism, each person's objective is kind of long-term welfare. And these are typically rejected by most philosophers because it violates the basic tenets of an ethical system, if you will. So kind of moving on, talking about some other methods of decision making, and we're getting ready to kind of wrap up. We're getting a little bit closer. Would be some other methods of ethical decision making. So some modern writers present approaches to applied ethics that do not directly include the ethical systems that we've talked about so far. So Krogstad and Robertson in 1979 described 3 principles of ethical decision making. And, they talked about something called the imperative principle, which directs a decision maker to act according to a specific unbending rule. They have a utilitarian principle that determines the ethics of conduct by the good or bad consequences of action, or generalization principle, which is based on kind of the question, what would happen if all similar persons acted this way under similar circumstances? So again, these are other methods of ethical decision making that we've kind of talked about. And then Cole and Meyer in 1995, they also provide us with a set of questions more specific to criminal justice professionals and a little more sensitive to the due process protections that are often discarded in a decision to commit an unethical act. So they propose that the individual decision maker should ask the following questions. Does the action violate another person's constitutional rights, including the right of due process? Does the action involve treating another person only as a means to an end? Is the action illegal? Do you predict that your action will produce more bad than good for all persons affected? And then finally, does the action violate department procedure or professional duty? So these are questions, again, that were brought kind of to light, again, by Close and Meyer in 1995. And these kind of fit a little bit more under the criminal justice umbrella. So finally, as we're kind of wrapping up, as we discussed back in Chapter 1, if confronted with an ethical dilemma, one can follow a series of steps to come to that ethical resolution. And in Chapter 1, we looked at those 5 steps, if you recall. Identifying the facts, identifying relevant values and concepts, identify all possible moral dilemmas for each party involved, decide what is the most immediate moral or ethical issue facing the individual, and then resolve the ethical or moral dilemma by using an ethical system or some other means of decision making. So again, remember, we talked about that at length in Chapter 1. Okay, just 2 or 3 more points, and we're going to wrap it up. We're going to talk a little bit now about relativism, absolutism, and universalism. And we're going to talk a little bit more just on a definition standpoint. So ethical relativism describes the position that what is good or bad changes depending upon the individual group, and that there are no moral absolutes, if you will. Relativists believe that what is right is determined by culture and or individual belief, and that there are no universal laws. Okay, so that's ethical relativism. Now, cultural relativism, basically cultural relativism defines good as that which contributes to the health and survival of society. Okay, what is acceptable in one society might not be to another, right? And who's to say which society is right? Now, there's a fatal flaw in relativism. Why should anyone obey their cultural norms since they might be right in another place or another time? So, you just have to kind of like think about, these particular questions. And then finally, the absolutism, the idea that what is wrong is always wrong and what is right is always right. And of course, you should never lie. Universalism, if you want to do something, you should be able to agree that everyone can do it. So, again, a lot of definitions, a lot of things to cover. But the last topic is going to be something that you will see in law enforcement quite a bit. And it's very applicable to your daily life. And it's called situational ethics. And it's often used as a synonym for relativism. However, if we clarify the term to include certain fundamental absolute elements, it might serve as a kind of a resolution to the problems inherent in both absolutist and a relativist approach to ethics. So recall that relativism, on the one hand, is criticized because it must follow any practice to be considered good. If it is considered good by some people, therefore even, human sacrifice and cannibalism would have to be considered moral. A thoroughly unpalatable consequence of accepting the doctrine, right? But, hey, it is what it is. Absolutism, on the other hand, is also less than satisfactory because, we can all think of some examples when the rule has to be broken, right? Even Kant declined to be purely absolutist in his argument that lying isn't really lying, if told to a person who is trying to harm you, right? What is needed then is, an approach that resolves both problems. So situational ethics, okay, is kind of the philosophical position that although there are a few universal truths, different situations call for a different response. Therefore, some actions can be right or wrong depending upon situational factors. Because things change, especially in policing and even in your life. It depends on the situation, right? So, thou shalt never lie. Well, if you're getting robbed or something like that and you lie to the robber, if you will, so you don't get shot and killed, that's based on the situation. So there can't always be those absolutes. And this is where situational ethics kind of comes into play, right? So a very interesting type definition, if you will. And along with that would be moral pluralism, the concept that there are fundamental truths that may dictate different definitions of what is moral in different situations, right? And there's a couple of ways to look at this. So, we can say, hey, there are basic principles of right and wrong. These principles can be applied to ethical dilemmas and issues, and these principles may call for different results in different situations depending on the need. So, when we kind of go back, just note that situational ethics is different from relativism because absolute laws are recognized. Okay, whereas under relativism, there are no absolute definitions of right and wrong. So again, a lot of stuff for us to kind of follow, right? So let me kind of wrap it up for you, and we'll be done with part 2. So, kind of concluding, ethical systems provide the guidelines or principles to make moral decisions, and we've seen a lot of different type of ethical systems. That's really what we've been discussing this entire chapter, right? And if you look in your textbook, you can see that there's a, box 2.4 summarizes the key principles of these different ethical systems. And it can happen that moral questions are decided in different ways under the same ethical system. For instance, if facts are in dispute, two people using utilitarianism may weigh the utilities, benefits, of an act differently. Capital punishment is supported by some because of a belief that it is a deterrent to people who might commit murder. Others argue it is wrong because it does not deter, and this is an argument, about facts between the two. And others believe that capital punishment is wrong regardless of its ability to deter. Maybe because of, religion. Most arguments about capital punishment get confused during the factual argument about the effectiveness of deterrence. The question is capital punishment wrong or right? Is a different question than does capital punishment deter? So again, that's why you really have to know the difference in these different ethical systems. And again, we've covered a lot. Another thing to consider is that none of us are perfect. We have all committed immoral or unethical acts that we know were probably wrong, right? And ethical systems help us to understand or analyze morality, but knowing what is right is no guarantee that we will always do the right thing. Few people follow such strong moral codes that they never lie or never cause other people harm, right? So we just, we have to kind of like look at that. Again, a lot of definitions. Make sure you use the key term matching exercise in your chapter, and then kind of go through each one of these ethical systems, if you will, to make sure that you don't kind of get confused on which one is which, because again, there are quite a few of them. So with that being said, that's going to conclude part 2 of chapter 2, determining moral behavior.